This is a seminar on modern neurocognitive technologies. The seminar takes place in the form of pre-recorded videos and online seminars, as well as in the form of online experiments in real time on different platforms. The seminar topics are applied cognitive psychology, neurocognitive studies of various stages of consciousness using devices and biofeedback. Today we have such an online seminar which is dedicated to 7 specific techniques for working with instrumental feedback. First of all, many thanks for attending the seminar. We have several speakers for August 2020. Please turn off your mic if you are not speaking at the moment, and questions and comments are welcome at any time, but please discussion better at the end of the seminar. Just to mention, we have running in parallel a national seminar. For instance, this presentation exists in 3 parts, which much more details. The community is quite strong. There is a lot of development inside. We will try to translate as much as we can from the national seminar. What is the main idea of this seminar? We have 3 areas related to human consciousness. The first one, consider it from the psychology side. For instance, neuro-linguistic programming, cognitive psychology, and then similar areas. The second one deals with ultra-weak biophysical interactions, neurocognitive research, corresponding sensitive measurement technologies, like EEG, different forms of spectroscopy, Kirlian effect, and similar. And the last area is related to self-development. For instance, yoga, qigong, reiki, different techniques from India, Tibet, and China, lucid dreaming, and similar approaches. And all of them consider consciousness from different sides. And unfortunately, there are not too many interactions between all 3 areas. The idea is to combine different approaches from psychology, modern measurement technologies, and self-development for more complementary consideration of unusual human capabilities. This area of research started early in 20th century. Most intensive development was started from 70s for applying instrumental methods for studying unusual status of human consciousness, and the seminar represent this approach on the modern level with modern devices. The seminar is mostly intended for researchers who use in laboratories different biofeedback and instrumental feedback technologies, but we also try to formulate all these methods as practical exercises that can be applied in different real situations. It was a short introduction to the seminar, and I'm starting now with a topic exploring unusual consciousness phenomena with device-based feedback, and will focus on 7 concrete neurocognitive techniques. This presentation is a part of a larger lecture. I show here only basic steps and techniques, and removed all supporting slide, statistic, and publication. For more details, I recommend referring to this larger lecture or to the publications. Technique 1 to 5 are of experimental nature. They have a large number of confirmation from different laboratories. Techniques 6 and 7 contain experimental components regarding embodiment and re-embodiment. In fact, they only indicate a possible direction for further research. This experimental nature must be taken into account when we will talk about these techniques. We start with cognitive psychology, with mental modeling and neurocognitive models. Our brain uses sensor data from objective reality for modeling. For instance, for generalizing observation, for creating creative imagination, for trance states, meditation, all mental efforts that generate cognitive, neurocognitive models. Why neurocognitive? Because they integrate our experience. We can generate new experience based on that models. They process, store, and use different sensing and actuating components from our behavior. So it's a complex structure that generate what we call a subjective reality for us. This subjective reality can be selected as a input source of data by the brain again, and used in the modeling for updating models, in turn updating reality again as a sensor input. And so this is an endless loop that used by our mental organization for different purposes. For instance, learning, adapting behavior. Here we can even generate some illusion and can get lost in this illusion. So it's a part of our psychical organization. For us, it's important that brain can use both as a sensor input from objective reality and from subjective reality. And they are used in the neurocognitive models. So it seems that neurocognitive models are central when we work with objective or subjective realities. Our brain is really brilliant in combining objective and subjective. And one example is tulpa. This is an old technique, huge community in different countries, so this effect definitely exists. And this is about creating imaginary friend. And this virtual structure behave fully autonomously, in many cases even unpredictable. And it seems the brain maintain not only the main personality, but also can maintain personality of our virtual friend. For us, it's important that this neurocognitive model represent a kind of augmented reality for a human person that combines both subjective and objective. And person even do not see any differences between objective and subjective. And here there are a lot of really interesting research questions. For instance, what is the relationship between subjective and objective? How this relationship influence the behavior of a person? Can it be used in some practical techniques for learning and adaptation? And a lot of similar questions. In our research, we also consider connected augmented reality, consisting of subjective part and objective part, and it is important it should be exactly the same object in this part and in this part as well. The question what we consider is neurocognitive modeling as a process. It change models and change subjective part of augmented reality. And the question is what is happening with the connected real part of this reality. We should say it's a purely experimental approach. We use the following methodology. Here measurement devices are connected to real object. We receive an objective feedback to our person. Person receive objective feedback. It integrated these changes in the models in the subjective part, and in this way the person can explore what is the dependency between this part and this part by observing the real-time feedback. Most interesting issues here are, first of all, it's objective verification with different measurement devices, so we avoid here any speculations about this topic. The second, we see a clear dependency with neurocognitive process, or with a mental state of this person. There's always two-way interactions between both realities and models. And new topic, what we consider, it's this physical embodiment of this neurocognitive model itself, so whether they can behave quite independently of its generating process. From the practical point of view, we consider here the trainability. The whole process for a person to work with augmented reality is trainable, and we need two feedback. One feedback for neurocognitive process, and second feedback through the whole loop from the real part of augmented reality. The question about dependency between objective reality and subjective reality usually is answered in the way they are fully independent. Moreover, objective reality is always primary and subjective is secondary. So we was teach it to answer this question in exactly this way. However, we think the dependency between objective part and subjective part for the case of mentally connected augmented reality should be explored in experimental way. This is an object of experimental validation. And this is an experiment with Qigong master. He make an attempt to influence measurement devices inside of this room, and there is no electromagnetic way for transferring the influence, no magnetic way, and also essential delay in the heat propagation from this side of the room to the side with sensors. This experiment was performed in ENN facility. Sensors inside the room were placed in two thermo-insulating containers. We used 4 electrochemical sensors, 4 thermochemical sensors, 4 temperature sensor inside containers, and several other sensors for recording environmental parameters. All sensors recorded data the whole night. Qigong master in Langfang entered the room at 9:15 and used this time for preparation and started the session at 9:30. The session that look like as shown here. So he was standing close to the room with a closed eye and used a kind of mental concentration on the sensors, and we demonstrated him the images of sensors. The behavior of sensors is shown here. We observe correlation and correlation between behavior of all electrochemical and thermochemical sensors exactly at the moment when he started the session. So we, in other words, we observe a correlation between begin of the modeling process in subjective part with a change of the behavior of real sensor in objective part of this mentally connected augmented reality. If we return back to the question between relationship of objective part and subjective part, it is not always so easy to answer. In several cases, we observe a clear dependency between mental modeling process and the behavior of object in a real environment. For exploration of such cases in systematic way, we use the setup with 2 feedback loops. One feedback loops is on the local level and provides the feedback from EEG sensors. Here the idea is to select specific stages of consciousness and to train them. For instance, we distinguish between four specific stages as a weak altered stage of consciousness, relaxation, deep meditation, and active meditation. They have a characteristic pattern of all brain waves, and observation is that active meditation contribute to this phenomena. And operator they have to train exactly at this active meditation stage. This local feedback provide the data in real time, for instance, as acoustic feedback. And the global feedback loop used impedance spectroscopy. So we use two different spectroscopy systems. One is electrochemical impedance, and another one is optical observation spectroscopy. So electrochemical system involve multiple quantum effects, and the current assumption that probably all these phenomena are connected on the quantum level. Electrochemical system provide data about mobility and number of ions, about change of temperature in the fluid, about thermochemical behavior, and about thermodynamics, the change of temperature in the local environment. We always use multiple such systems for accumulation of statistics. Another methodological consideration is related to difficulty levels in the modeling task. The first level appears if the operator can touch the object, or at least can see the object of concentration at the distance about 5 to 7 meters. Effects are most intensively represented in this case, but thermal effects are also possible. They should be carefully removed from experimental setup. And on the second level of complexity, operator does not see the object of concentration, but he or she receives real-time feedback. In general, some information about the object. We use information from devices that is electronically transferred over the internet. So in this case, really long distances are possible. On the third level of complexity, operator does not see the object of concentration and does not receive any feedback. This is a really challenging case. Some experts meet this case in a real situation, and there are even some books that describe such attempts. The last level of complexity appears if the operator does not see the object of concentration and also does not receive any feedback, but additionally incorporate our intention into the modeling process. Finally, we end up with 7 practical techniques trainable with instrumental feedback, what I mentioned in the beginning of this presentation. We separated them into 2 blocks, simple and complex, and techniques that require mental discipline and long-term motivation from operators. The first block is in fact obtained from 4 difficulties level mentioned in the previous slide. Technique number 5 exploits 2 ways interactions for reading out information from subjective and objective parts of reality and perform synchronization of models. There is enough information published about this method, so I will not mention it here. Number 6 and 7 are considered as a possible indicator for further research. We have some experimental evidences for their plausibility, but both require further intensive research. Now I will show examples for all these techniques and start with the first one, training the focus of attention, or in another terminology, creation of a neurocognitive model. Typically, sensors and operators are placed in two different laboratories. We have two setups. First, local one at the distance about 10-15 meters between them with multiple concrete walls, so we fully exclude thermal or electromagnetic effects. And the long distance setup at the distance about 3 kilometers. Sensors are recording continuously all the time. Operator enters the room for operators a couple minutes before the experiment. They start preparation. For instance, here is a typical example for relaxation stage of an operator. And they start then the experiment. Experiment typically take between 10 and 30 minutes. Brainwaves are also recorded, and here we observe a typical pattern for active meditation, where the operator first mentally concentrate on the object of concentration, then use visual feedback for updating model, then again the concentration, and we observe a clear correlation between the beginning of this mental concentration task and the response of real sensors. Of interest is that not only the start point is correlated, but also end of the concentration task is also correlated with another change of the trend of electrochemical sensors. So here important is exactly this correlation between concentration time and the response. The first and the second is a statistical repeatability, because this can be a random change in the behavior, so we need to perform multiple repetitive tests. Typically we use 30 iterations for one block. If operator perform it once per day, so we need 1 month for a block of experiments. Results in the blocks are evaluated in numerical, probabilistic and statistic ways. And here are random experiments, or results of 3 criteria for random experiments and for experiments with a concentration of attention from the last years, and we see a clear difference at all 3 criteria. These results are published. Up to now, we performed a few hundreds of such experiments. The setup and methodology are fully automated. They can be performed individually at laboratories and publicly on the web. And the Aquapsi is one example of such fully automated experiments. And we see really many hundreds of attempts, so totally a large number of statistically significant results, and we already started the process of their publications. Technique 1 and Technique 2 are similar. We always suggest starting with short distances and then step by step to increase the distance. Now we will proceed with Technique 3, modeling intentions and incorporating intention into the subjective models. How it's work? Operator perform modeling in the mentally augmented reality with the subjective parts, and start to change a mental model, and they observe an objective part of this mentally augmented reality. And operator try to find some changes of the model that can induce corresponding changes of real objects. Here capabilities of devices are limited. We can record only 2 opposite intentions. In electrochemical reactions, their intensity can be increased or decreased to some extent, and we can observe this as a change of the trend in graphs. And operators try first to learn how to induce a change in one way and then in another way. And for instance, in the electrochemical dynamics, such a trend is impossible to generate in random dynamics. The success rate for Technique 1 and 2 is between 70 and 90%. Here is much lower because complexity of this task is very high. It requires really a lot of time for learning. This exercise can be performed in many different ways. For instance, here operator concentrates on one channel and try to induce several changes one after another. Here is the same diagram but in colors, different channels. Operator in one channel induced reducing of electrochemical reactions, and another channel is used for increasing the intensity of electrochemical reaction, and this will be visible as this different color trend. And the time difference between two attempts is about 10 minutes, very short time. Here is the same in one channel, but operator use mental representation as minus and plus. And in this example as uptrend and downtrend, so that's always as internal representation at all operators is completely different. And here, for instance, the difference between two attempts is about 20 minutes. For such exercises, plants are frequently used as sensors. They are quite sensitive for this task. Almost all experiments are performed in 80s and 90s, so very using plant as sensors. Here is a replication of such attempts. We are recording conductivity of tissues. And operator was sitting here the whole time, and at this moment he starts mental modeling. He was receiving feedback from that device, and at this time he changed pattern, modeling pattern, and he here stopped, and he here left the room. And we observe visual changes of trend of tissue conductivity at each of these points, so and can correlate the mental task of operator with a change of tissue conductivity of the plant. The technique 4 conceptually differs from previous techniques and is related to so-called active symbols and integration in the modeling process. We know that symbols are frequently used in different social and cultural contexts, from religion ones, in the healing, in self-development. For instance, here are 6 yoga of Naropa, and using specific symbols is required in these techniques. So the hypothesis here that if the operator integrate in the mental modeling process active symbols, not all symbols are active, then this will have unusual effects on physical and biological system. It needs here to underline this topic requires experimental verification to avoid any kind of speculations. We performed such experiments quite a long time, about 5 years, with a different series of attempts. For instance, using graphical symbols, using text symbols, and multiple control attempts with operator, without operator. Operator are reading different neutral text just to avoid artifacts in such experiments. Here is a typical screenshot from automated experiments. Electrochemical dynamics is shown in background measurement region and experimental region. Deviations are expressed in numerical form as psi and pro values and are represented as graphical diagrams for operators. They can observe this diagram and use them as visual feedback in training exercises. Immediate result what we receive with active symbols, in this case Reiki, that experiments when operator integrate Reiki symbols in the modeling process are much stronger. In statistics, we perform 5 series of experiments, each series 1 month. So with a random attempt, 3 months with different distance influences, and 1 block with distant Reiki attempts. And we see that Reiki are statistically much stronger than if the operator do not use these active symbols in the modeling process. Another interesting result with Reiki is related to weak altered states of consciousness. As I already said, operators in such states are not producing any measurable effects on electrochemical sensors. But if operators are using them, and we see a clear deviation in the behavior of sensors during the time if operators use Reiki symbols in the modeling process. So influence of the operator with Reiki techniques is visible even in weak altered stage of consciousness, where usually mental influences are not recorded. So this produces a lot of open and interesting questions. For instance, it seems that operators are not responsible for such changes. Symbols are responsible, but where this effect of symbols is coming from, if not from the operator. Comparing different experiments with a symbolic system, we can make 2 conclusions. The first conclusion is related to cases without operators and with operators who are reading neutral text. We see that even if operators are not focused on the main task but are in the context of the experiment, this is already enough to have a small effect on sensors. The second conclusion is related to comparing a symbolic experiment and control attempt. By calibrating control to 0, we see a significantly stronger experiment with mantras and prayers, and programmable symbolic mechanism, what I will discuss in the next slide. And this create open question about the origin of this effect, whether symbols are linked to some hidden capabilities of human consciousness or they are external to human consciousness. After considering techniques 1 to 4 with several examples and practical experimental results, the question is, what is their final goal and where they are leading to? There is a normal question for research where we try to identify some potentially interesting goals and research fields and then try to explore them. However, here we discovered another dimension represented by operators who practice these techniques. They were interested in specific questions appearing from practical side, and finally this technique 6 and 7 appears as a combination of potentially interesting research goals and several questions asked by operators. For understanding the technique 6, we return to the slide about mentally connected augmented reality, about neurocognitive models that generate this structure, and in turn these neurocognitive models that are created by the modeling process in the brain. Exactly because of this modeling process, a common assumption is that models are contained in the brain, so they have a physical embodiment in the brain of the operator. We know that in this field of research, some questions are not so obvious. And here we explore one interesting hypothesis about physical embodiment of such neurocognitive models. Namely, if the model can be to some extent independent from this generating process, so if it is one time generated, so if it can exist more or less autonomously with some basic cognitive functionality. So in the terminology of cognitive psychology, we explore the exteriorization process of neurocognitive models. And again, this is an experimental approach that we are going to explore in experiment with devices and instrumental feedback. This hypothesis was tested in the following way. Operator generate a mental model and then tried to transfer this model to this object. So he tried to make a re-embodiment of the model from, let's say, our brain to this object. This model contained the simplest program with the stimuli. If the stimuli is on, then put some influence on the sensor. If the operator, he performed the programming about 10-15 minutes. After this, he left the room for 1-2 days. He was not in connection with this object. Stimuli was periodically activated one time per day, one time per 12 hours, one time per 6 hours. And we tested whether LED, it was a small LED, small current LED, whether LED can influence directly the sensor, or some empty object can influence the sensor with and without LED. So in these control attempts, we did not record any changes of the behavior of the sensors. In experiments, when LED was activated, so when stimulus is activated, we see a change of the behavior, and if the stimulus is deactivated, we again receive a change in the behavior. This very nice response was repeated 2-3 times usually. In total, we can register up to 6-7 activation after this effect completely disappears. So we observe a gradual disappearance of the effect after initial programming. This experiment was repeated multiple number of times. This is one of the latest attempts with multiple thermo-insulating containers. This container has this programmable object and small current LED. The behavioral program has a form: if light on, then impact sensors in one of these containers, else sleep. Experimental methodology was changed to a periodical programming of the object by operator. So operator program it, and we record a number of successful activation by stimulus. Then next day operator program it again, and so we receive a dependency between the number of activations to the number of programming attempts. Generally, we record the same behavior as in the previous cases. Here is LED is activated. We receive a response after a short time. Then in the next activation, we receive again a change of the trend. And so this behavior is well repeated a few times after initial activations. But generally we observe, like in previous cases, a gradual disappearance of the effect after initial programming. We tried to apply different techniques here, for instance using symbols to amplify the effect. In total we record a good repeatability of experiments in such setup. This experiment indicated that a part of neurocognitive model can be exteriorized and receive a form of non-biological embodiment with elements of computational, cognitive, and physical functionality. The big question is where is then our consciousness? Which part of the structure contained our consciousness? We know that for consciousness important is cognitive and computational functionality, which are contained in our brain, physical and sensory motor functionality that contained in our body. So this create a biological embodiment. For consciousness is important is modeling process and the models, both in more abstract and more body-related part, and we know that a part of this model can be exteriorized. So our assumption is that consciousness is spread over the whole structure, over the different components with different functionality, and the whole structure as a whole that creates the phenomenon of consciousness that we know. The question is, what will happen if one part of the structure will disappear? For instance, we will lose our biological embodiment, whether this non-biological embodiment is still capable for maintaining functionality of our consciousness. This philosophical question lead us to the concrete technique 7 related to re-embodiment from biological to non-biological structure. This approach is frequently mentioned in different sources on self-development in Tantric Buddhism, for instance, 6 Yogas of Naropa, Dzogchen, and similar sources. One of frequently mentioned problem is so-called unstable non-biological embodiment. We also have the observations in our experiments where programmable objects are unstable and they disappear after a while after initial programming. It seems that these sources developed some way to resolve this problem even during physical life, so-called short way in Tantric Buddhism. In experiments, we also see possible indications for a way to stabilize non-biological embodiment. Exactly this problem was of interest for our operators. They essentially contributed to development of this technique. From a scientific point of view, we probably meet here a possible non-biological evolution related to re-embodiment of our consciousness. This is the last slide, just to give a brief overview about possible approaches for the technique 7. We call it training of non-biological cognitivity. It starts with creating such a non-biological structure by using one of yogas, for instance, yoga, tuma, or kundalini yoga, and then training of basic cognitive skills. It's very similar what we done in our childhood, touching object, feeling, developing different sensing and motor capabilities. And here device-based feedback can be integrated. First of all, for reality check to see whether the whole structure is illusion and created by our subjective modeling process, or we have here at least some components related to reality. Then here we can train specific activities. For instance, this graph was generated in situations like this for testing one of specific activities of non-biological structure. Generally, operators train mostly with different real situations, or other person is entering a non-biological embodiment and they start multiple subjective reality, for instance, collective lucid dreams or some teaching exercises. Here we meet already some mystic dimension of this technique 7. A general conclusion. We represented 7 specific techniques, 1 to 5 have many hundreds of experiments in different laboratories, publication, and we think their main application should be for the operator for self-development purposes. And of course this requires a lot of mental discipline and long-term motivation. About ultimate goal, we and operators think that immortality of consciousness, possible immortality, should represent this highest goal. Of course, a lot of questions. We can repeat again as sources of Tantric Buddhism saying that stabilizing this non-biological embodiment can be achieved during the life, but it needs learning and active training. Instrumental methods can essentially help here. First of all, removing and bypassing some of illusions and speeding up the progress. And about techniques 6 and 7, of course, a lot of open questions. But we think they are possible and they are not developed by evolutionary mechanisms. We need to develop them from scratch, and probably they represent unclear non-biological evolution with a lot of implication even from a philosophical side. This was a short presentation for the seminar. Some points may sound unusual or do not fit into the framework of classical ideas. Exactly here, instrumental feedback shows its usefulness in separating the real from the illusory and enabling to focus on real processes. In general, if you have any questions, please post them in comments, and welcome to the next seminar.